Paris, France, September 1943. In a cramped attic workshop on Rue de la Fontaine, 17-year-old Marie Dubois carefully inserted a folded square of silk, no larger than a playing card, into the hollow torso of a porcelain doll. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sealed the opening with glue, her breath visible in the cold autumn air. Outside, German patrols marched through the streets below, their boots echoing against cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of history, but nothing quite like this. Marie believed she was simply helping a few stranded airmen find their way home, perhaps a dozen at most over the coming months. She had no idea that her seemingly innocent collection of handmade dolls would become one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire European conflict, saving hundreds of lives and confounding the occupying forces for nearly 2 years. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how a teenage girl's passion for doll making, dismissed by neighbors as a childish obsession, became an unbreakable code that military intelligence officers on both sides would study for decades to come. It is a story of how the smallest acts of courage, multiplied across time, can reshape the outcome of history itself. Marie had learned the art of doll making from her grandmother, Élise Dubois, a master craftswoman who had supplied toy shops across Paris before the occupation began in 1940. The workshop had been in their family for 3 generations, tucked away in the Latin Quarter, where artists and intellectuals had long made their home. When the German forces arrived, most businesses shuttered or were seized, but the doll workshop seemed too insignificant to warrant attention. After all, what threat could come from an elderly woman and her granddaughter creating toys? The truth was far more complex. Élise had connections to the French resistance through her late husband. When British and American airmen began getting taken down over occupied France in increasing numbers during 1942 and 43, the resistance faced a critical challenge: how to help these men evade capture without the occupying forces discovering the escape routes. Paper maps were impossible to conceal during frequent inspections. Anyone caught with military maps faced immediate detention. The resistance needed something so ordinary that guards would wave it through without a second glance. That solution arrived in the form of Claude Beaumont, a former cartographer who had escaped from a labor camp and returned to Paris. Claude possessed an extraordinary skill. He could reproduce maps from memory with remarkable accuracy, but his maps needed to be small, easily hidden, and made from materials that wouldn't deteriorate. Élise met Claude through resistance contacts in early January 1943. Claude explained the problem. They had already lost 3 couriers carrying paper maps. The maps had been discovered during searches. Élise listened carefully, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Then she reached into her bag and withdrew something that made Claude pause. A simple cloth doll, the kind that children had played with for generations. She turned it over to reveal a nearly invisible seam in the back. With practiced fingers, she opened the seam to expose a hollow cavity inside the doll's body. "Silk," she said simply. "We can print on silk. It doesn't rustle like paper. It doesn't disintegrate when wet, and it can be folded to the size of a postage stamp." She paused, letting the implications settle. And who would suspect a grandmother making dolls for children? Claude stared at the doll, his mind racing through possibilities. Silk could indeed hold detailed printing if the right techniques were used. The British were already experimenting with silk maps for their pilots, but those were being produced in England and smuggled into France with great difficulty and frequent failures. What if they could produce the maps right here in Paris, literally under the noses of the occupation? Within 2 weeks they had assembled a small team. Claude would create the maps, reducing entire regions of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands to miniature scale. A former textile printer named Henri Marchand would transfer the maps onto silk squares measuring approximately 7 centimeters by 7 centimeters, and Marie would incorporate these maps into her dolls, creating what appeared to be an innocent collection of handmade toys. Marie's role expanded beyond mere craftswoman. At 17, she possessed qualities that made her uniquely suited for this dangerous work. She looked even younger than her age, with a round face and wide eyes that made her seem harmless and naive. German soldiers at checkpoints often smiled at her and waved her through without searching her carefully. She played into this perception, dressing simply and carrying her dolls in a worn canvas bag, chattering nervously about selling them to help support her grandmother. The first test came in late February 1943. A British pilot named James Richardson had been taken down near Amiens and had made his way to Paris through a network of safe houses. He needed to reach the Spanish border, a journey of nearly 800 kilometers through occupied territory. The resistance could provide him with civilian clothes, forged identity papers, and money, but without a map, he would be traveling blind, dependent entirely on guides who might or might not appear at the designated meeting points. Marie met Richardson in the basement of a pharmacy on Rue Mouffetard. She remembered being struck by how exhausted he looked, his face gaunt, and his hands shaking slightly as he accepted the cup of weak coffee she offered him. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old, though his eyes held the weariness of someone far older. She handed him what appeared to be a simple rag doll, the kind a child might drag around by one arm. The doll wore a faded blue dress and had yarn for hair, its face painted with a simple smile. Richardson looked at it with confusion, clearly wondering if this was some kind of joke. Marie demonstrated, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened the seam at the back of the doll's neck and withdrew the silk square, unfolding it to reveal an incredibly detailed map showing the route from Paris to the Pyrenees, with safe houses marked by tiny dots that could be mistaken for printing floors. Major checkpoints were indicated by almost invisible pinpricks, and alternate routes were marked with thread so fine it looked like part of the fabric's weave. Richardson's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. He studied the map intently, memorizing key details before carefully refolding it and tucking it back into the doll. "Brilliant," he whispered, "absolutely brilliant." He made it to Spain in 17 days, traveling mostly at night and avoiding the major checkpoints by using the alternate routes marked on the map. His report to British intelligence, delivered after he reached Gibraltar, mentioned the map but not its source, as per the security protocols. However, word began to spread through the informal networks that connected the various resistance groups. There was a new way to get maps to evaders, one that had proven reliable. The demand grew rapidly. By April 1943, Marie was producing approximately 3 dolls per week, each one containing a different map, depending on the needs of the person who would receive it. Some maps showed routes to Spain, others to Switzerland or the coast, where small boats might attempt crossings to England. Each map was unique, tailored to the specific circumstances and the latest intelligence about checkpoint locations and patrol patterns. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Claude spent hours creating each map, working by candlelight in a different location each week to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. Henri printed the maps on silk salvaged from old scarves, curtains, and clothing that Elise's network collected through sympathetic neighbors. They used a special ink mixture that Henri had developed, one that wouldn't run if the silk got wet and wouldn't fluoresce under the ultraviolet lights that occupation authorities sometimes used to detect hidden documents. Marie's part required steady hands and infinite patience. Each doll had to be constructed so that the hidden compartment was completely undetectable, even if the doll was squeezed or examined closely. She developed techniques for weighting the dolls correctly so they didn't feel hollow, using scraps of fabric and sawdust to create the proper heft and give. She varied her designs constantly, making boy dolls and girl dolls, dolls in different costumes, dolls of different sizes, so that no pattern would emerge that might alert suspicious observers. The operation expanded in ways none of them had anticipated. By summer 1943, they weren't just helping downed airmen. Resistance fighters who needed to move between regions began requesting the map dolls. Jewish families being smuggled toward Switzerland asked for them. Even some members of the French underground government in exile, parachuting back into France for covert missions, carried Marie's dolls as backup navigation tools. The close calls were inevitable. In June 1943, Marie was stopped at a checkpoint near the Gare de Lyon by a particularly thorough German soldier who decided to search her bag of dolls. She watched, her heart hammering in her chest, as he picked up each doll and examined it. One of the dolls in her bag contained a map showing safe houses in Lyon, marked with codes that would be easily recognizable to anyone with training in reading intelligence documents. The soldier squeezed the doll, turned it over, even held it up to the light. Marie forced herself to breathe normally, to maintain the slightly vacant smile she had practiced. She babbled nervously about how she was taking the dolls to a toy shop in the Marais, how her grandmother was sick and Marie had to handle the deliveries now, how business was so difficult during these times. The soldier handed the doll back. "They're well made," he said in heavily accented French. "My daughter would like one of these." He looked at Marie with something that might have been kindness. "How much?" Marie's mind raced. She couldn't sell him the doll with the map inside, but refusing might arouse suspicion. "These are already promised to the shop," she said quickly, "but I can make one specially for your daughter. What color dress would she like?" They arranged for Marie to deliver a doll to the checkpoint the following week. She spent 3 sleepless nights crafting a special doll, one that genuinely was just a toy, putting extra care into the details. When she delivered it, the soldier seemed genuinely pleased, paying her with French francs that she immediately donated to the Resistance Fund for supporting families of detained members. But the incident shook her. They had been lucky this time, but luck was not a strategy. Marie convinced Elise and Claude that they needed to improve their security measures. They began using code words to communicate about deliveries, never speaking directly about maps or evaders. Marie developed a system for marking her dolls. Those containing maps had a specific number of stitches in the hem of their clothing, invisible to casual observers, but immediately recognizable to trained recipients. By autumn 1943, the operation had helped more than 80 people reach safety. The number seemed miraculous to Marie, who still sometimes couldn't believe that her childhood hobby had become something so significant. She kept a hidden record, not of names which would be too dangerous, but of small details. The British pilot who cried when she handed him the doll because it reminded him of his daughter back home. The Belgian resistance fighter who kissed her hand and called her an angel. The Jewish mother who clutched the doll and whispered prayers in Hebrew. The work took its toll. Marie lost weight, her face growing thin from stress and irregular meals. Paris in wartime was a city of shortages, where bread was rationed and meat was a distant memory for most civilians. The long hours in the drafty attic workshop left her with a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Her grandmother worried constantly, but Marie refused to stop. She had seen too many faces, heard too many stories of what awaited those who were captured. Each doll she completed represented hope, represented a life that might be saved. The operation's success created its own dangers. As more people reached safety and told their stories, British and American intelligence officers began to piece together that something unusual was happening in Paris. Reports mentioned consistently accurate maps, better than the ones being produced in England and smuggled across the Channel. Allied intelligence wanted to know more about the source, not to shut it down, but to potentially replicate the technique elsewhere. This attention, however well-intentioned, created risks. Increased radio traffic asking about the maps might be intercepted. Queries from newly arrived agents might reach the wrong ears. The more successful the operation became, the greater the chance that occupation authorities would notice the pattern of evaders successfully navigating French territory. In November 1943, disaster nearly struck. A courier carrying 3 of Marie's dolls was detained at a checkpoint in Lyon. The man, whose name was Antoine Roussel, had been working with the resistance for nearly a year and had successfully completed dozens of missions. But this time, something about his demeanor or his papers aroused suspicion. He was taken to a holding facility for questioning. The dolls were confiscated and sent to occupation headquarters for examination. For 3 agonizing days, Marie and her small team waited to see if their operation had been exposed. They prepared emergency plans. Claude would flee to the countryside, Henri would destroy his printing equipment, and Marie and Elise would claim they were simply toy makers who had no knowledge of what was being hidden in some of their products. Then word came back through the resistance network. The examination had found nothing. The German intelligence officers had cut open the dolls, destroying them in the search, but they hadn't thought to look for the nearly invisible seams that Marie had crafted with such care. They had found the hollow spaces and the wadding, but not the silk maps, which were folded so small and flat that they looked like part of the doll's internal structure. The examiners concluded that the dolls were simply poorly made toys with shoddy construction that left gaps in the stuffing. Antoine Roussel was released after 2 weeks, having endured questioning but revealed nothing. When he returned to Paris, thin and bruised but alive, his first request was for Marie to teach him how she made the dolls so perfectly undetectable. She spent an afternoon showing him her techniques, explaining how she had learned to think like an examiner, to anticipate what someone would look for and ensure it wasn't there. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the coldest in decades. Paris froze under snow and ice, and fuel was so scarce that Marie and Elise often worked wearing gloves with the fingertips cut off, their breath misting in the frigid attic. But the work continued. If anything, the winter made the maps even more crucial, as the harsh conditions made navigation more difficult and dangerous for those trying to evade capture. Marie developed new techniques during this period. She began creating dolls with multiple compartments, allowing a single doll to carry not just a map, but also documents, currency, or tiny coded messages. She experimented with different materials, discovering that certain types of cotton batting could be formed into shapes that perfectly disguised the silk packages. She even developed a technique for making the maps water-resistant by treating the silk with a wax compound that Henri formulated. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for what would become the landings in Normandy, the map doll operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than its simple origins. Marie's network now included several other young women who had learned her techniques, each producing dolls in different parts of Paris and even in other French cities. The maps themselves had grown more detailed, incorporating intelligence about troop movements, supply depots, and defensive positions that resistance observers had noted. The doll makers never met each other for security reasons, communicating only through intermediaries. But Marie often thought about these other young women, working in their own hidden workshops, carefully folding silk and sealing seams, each one a small act of defiance against an occupation that had seemed invincible just years before. One of Marie's most remarkable creations came in April 1944. An American intelligence officer operating undercover in Paris needed detailed information about coastal defenses in Normandy, but couldn't risk carrying documents. Marie created a special doll, larger than her usual designs, that contained not one but 5 separate maps, each showing different sections of the coast with remarkable detail. The maps included information about beach obstacles, artillery positions, and the locations of fortified structures, all gathered by resistance members at great personal risk. The officer, whose real name Marie never knew, examined the doll with the careful attention of someone trained to spot hidden compartments and deception. He spent nearly 15 minutes going over every inch of the construction before nodding in satisfaction. "If I didn't know what I was looking for," he said in English-accented French, "I would never find it. This is extraordinary work." That doll made it successfully to England, where the maps contributed to the planning for the June landings. Marie wouldn't learn this until years later, but she often wondered about that particular doll, about where it went and what it helped accomplish. The most dangerous period came in the weeks immediately following the Normandy landings. As Allied forces fought their way inland, occupation authorities in Paris became increasingly nervous and unpredictable. Checkpoints multiplied, searches became more thorough, and the consequences of being caught with contraband became even more severe. Several members of the resistance network were detained during this period, though fortunately none who knew about the doll operation specifically. Marie had a moment of profound fear when German soldiers came to the workshop in early July, demanding to see what they were producing. Elise handled the situation with remarkable composure, showing them the workspace and explaining the doll-making process. One soldier picked up a doll that actually contained a map and studied it carefully. Marie continued working, forcing her hands to remain steady. The soldier examined the stitching closely. "These are very well made," he said. "My wife would appreciate craftsmanship like this." After the soldiers left, Marie sat down suddenly, releasing the terror she had kept hidden during the inspection. As summer progressed and Allied forces continued their advance toward Paris, the nature of the work shifted. Instead of helping individuals escape occupied territory, the maps now helped coordinate resistance activities within Paris itself. Marie created dolls containing maps that showed German defensive positions in the city, locations of ammunition depots, and routes that resistance fighters could use to move through Paris without encountering major checkpoints. The liberation of Paris in late August 1944 felt both sudden and inevitable. Marie was in the workshop when she heard the bells of Notre Dame ringing, followed by bells from churches across the city, a sound that had been forbidden during the occupation. People flooded into the streets laughing and crying, embracing strangers. The German forces were withdrawing, and French and Allied troops were entering the city. Marie and Elise stood at their attic window, watching the celebrations below. Marie held one of her dolls, this one genuinely just a toy with no hidden compartments. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Elise put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "This part is over," she said. "But what you've done, what we've done together, that matters will matter for a very long time." In the weeks and months that followed, as Paris recovered and rebuilt, the full scope of the map doll operation began to emerge. Allied intelligence officers interviewed Marie and her team, documenting their methods and collecting examples of the dolls. They were astounded by the sophistication of the operation and the remarkable fact that it had never been fully discovered despite operating for nearly 2 years. The statistics were carefully compiled. Marie and her network had produced approximately 430 dolls containing maps or documents. Of these, roughly 360 had been successfully delivered to their intended recipients. The dolls had directly aided in helping more than 280 individuals reach safety, including Allied airmen, resistance fighters, and civilians fleeing persecution. Not a single person carrying one of Marie's dolls had been detained because of the map being discovered. British intelligence was particularly interested in the technical aspects. They examined the dolls microscopically, studying Marie's stitching techniques and the way she had created hidden compartments that were nearly impossible to detect. Some of her methods were subsequently incorporated into training programs for intelligence officers, teaching them new ways to conceive of hiding sensitive materials. But perhaps the most significant moment came in October 1944, when Marie received an unexpected visitor. James Richardson, the British pilot who had been her first recipient back in February 1943, had returned to Paris. He was in uniform now, newly promoted, and he carried a package wrapped in brown paper. They met in a cafe near the Seine, the same area where Marie had delivered so many dolls during the occupation. Richardson looked different now, healthy and confident, no longer the frightened and exhausted young man hiding in a pharmacy basement. He handed her the package. Inside was the doll she had given him, carefully preserved. The blue dress was faded, and one of the yarn pigtails was loose, evidence of the hard journey it had taken. "I carried this all the way to Spain," Richardson said, "and then I carried it back to England. And now I've brought it back to Paris because I wanted you to know. This little doll saved my life. Without it, I would have been completely lost. I would have probably been detained within the first 2 days." He paused, his voice becoming thick with emotion. "But more than that, every time I was scared or tired or thought about giving up, I would look at this doll and remember that someone in Paris, someone I had never met, cared enough to help me. That kept me going." Marie held the doll, fighting back tears. It seemed impossible that this small object, which she had made in a few hours one cold February afternoon, had traveled so far and meant so much. She thought about all the other dolls she had made, scattered now across Europe, some probably lost or destroyed, but others perhaps treasured by those who had carried them to freedom. Richardson wasn't the only one to return. Over the following months, others came back to Paris seeking the young woman who had given them hope, disguised as a simple toy. An American navigator brought flowers. A Belgian resistance fighter brought a letter from his wife, thanking Marie for bringing her husband home. A Jewish woman brought her daughter, born in Switzerland after her mother had fled France with one of Marie's dolls, showing the route to safety. The workshop on Rue de la Fontaine became something of a pilgrimage site for those whose lives had been touched by the operation. Elise, though increasingly frail, welcomed them all, making weak tea from their meager supplies and listening to stories of journeys and escapes, of fear and hope and survival. Marie herself struggled with the aftermath. She had spent her teenage years doing work that most adults would find terrifying. Now at 19, she found herself uncertain about what came next, but she underestimated how her story would resonate. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre. Allied governments sent commendations, but the recognition that meant most came from the resistance networks themselves. In 1946, Marie was invited to London to speak with British intelligence about her work. One senior officer told her that her methods had revolutionized their thinking about concealment. "We were so focused on sophisticated technical solutions," he explained, "hidden cameras, invisible inks, complex codes, and here you were, a teenager in an attic, creating something that defeated all our best detection methods, using nothing but basic sewing skills and careful thought. You taught us that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." Marie returned to Paris, and with some of the recognition money she had received, expanded the workshop. She and Elise began teaching their techniques to young women who wanted to learn traditional crafts. The workshop became known for producing exceptional handmade dolls, though now they contained no secrets beyond the skill and care that went into their creation. Elise passed away peacefully in 1949, surrounded by dolls she and Marie had made together. Marie continued the workshop alone for several years, but her heart wasn't fully in it. The dolls reminded her too much of those intense, frightening years when each one represented not just craftsmanship, but life and death. In 1952, Marie made a decision that surprised many who knew her. She enrolled in university to study history. She wanted to understand the broader context of what she had lived through, to see her small part in the larger story of the conflict and resistance. She excelled in her studies, eventually earning a doctorate and becoming a respected historian, specializing in civilian resistance movements during wartime. Throughout her academic career, Marie rarely spoke publicly about her own experiences. She believed that history was about more than individual stories, that it was about understanding systems and patterns and the ways ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. But she also collected stories from other resistance workers, particularly women whose contributions had been overlooked or minimized in official histories. In the 1970s, as interest in the French resistance experienced a revival, Marie was finally persuaded to write a detailed memoir of her experiences. The book, titled Silk and Secrets, became an unexpected success, not just in France but internationally. Readers were captivated by the story of the teenage girl who had created one of the most effective intelligence tools of the occupation period, using nothing but skill, courage, and creativity. Marie lived to see her story adapted for film and theater, though she maintained that the dramatizations never quite captured the terrifying ordinariness of what she had done. It wasn't glamorous, she insisted in interviews. It was cold attic rooms and constantly being afraid and fingers that hurt from stitching by candlelight. But it was also knowing that what you did mattered, that you were helping people survive, and that feeling made everything else bearable. She kept in touch with many of those she had helped over the years. Richardson became a lifelong friend, visiting Paris regularly with his family. The Jewish woman whose escape she had aided named her daughter Marie. The resistance fighters she had worked with remained close, meeting annually to remember those who hadn't survived and celebrate those who had. One of the most touching moments came in 1994, during the 50th anniversary celebrations of Paris's liberation. Marie, now 70 years old, was invited to participate in commemorative events. At one ceremony, she was approached by a German man about her age who introduced himself as the son of the soldier who had bought a doll from her for his daughter. "My father kept that doll his entire life," the man said through tears. After the conflict, he struggled with what he had been part of, with the things he had witnessed, and sometimes failed to prevent. But he always said that doll reminded him that even in the darkest times, there were people doing good things, creating beauty, and helping others. It gave him some measure of peace. He handed Marie a photograph, a little girl holding one of Marie's dolls, smiling shyly at the camera. "My sister," he explained. "She died young, but she loved that doll. My father wanted me to find you someday, to thank you for that small kindness in a time when kindness was rare." Marie held the photograph, thinking about how complicated history was, how individual lives and choices wove together in ways that couldn't be predicted or fully understood. She had been so focused on helping the resistance that she had never considered that her dolls might also represent something important to those on the other side of the occupation, that a simple toy could carry meaning beyond its intended purpose. In her final years, Marie established a foundation to preserve the history of civilian resistance during wartime. She donated her remaining dolls, including the one Richardson had returned to her, to museums where they could be studied and remembered. She funded scholarships for young people studying history, particularly those interested in how ordinary individuals respond to extraordinary challenges. Marie Dubois passed away in 2007 at the age of 83. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including children and grandchildren of those she had helped during the occupation. Several elderly men and women brought dolls that they or their parents had carried to freedom more than 60 years earlier, placing them gently on her casket as a final tribute. The workshop on Rue de la Fontaine still stands, now marked with a plaque that reads, "Here, Marie Dubois and Elise Dubois created hope during the darkest days of occupation. Their dolls carried more than maps. They carried proof that courage takes many forms and that the smallest acts, repeated with determination, can change the course of history." The story of Marie's dolls has been studied extensively by military historians and intelligence analysts. Her techniques have been taught in various forms to intelligence operatives around the world. But perhaps more importantly, her story has become emblematic of a larger truth about resistance and survival. That it wasn't just soldiers and spies who determined outcomes, but also teenagers in attics, elderly women in workshops, and countless others whose names history never recorded. In the archives of British intelligence, carefully preserved in climate-controlled facilities, are several of Marie's dolls. Researchers occasionally examine them, marveling at the craftsmanship and the ingenuity. But even more impressive than the technical skill is what these dolls represent: the determination of people to help each other in times of crisis, to resist oppression through whatever means available, and to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible. The silk maps themselves, when carefully unfolded under proper lighting, reveal not just geographic details, but tiny markings that served multiple purposes. Some indicated safe houses, others marked dangerous areas. Still others contained coded information that only specific recipients could interpret. Each map was unique, tailored to its recipient's needs and the latest intelligence available. This customization was part of what made the operation so effective and so difficult for authorities to detect. Claude Beaumont, the cartographer who created the original maps, survived the occupation and continued his work with geographic services after liberation. He never sought recognition for his role in the operation, preferring to let Marie receive the credit he felt she more than deserved. When interviewed late in his life, he simply said, "I made the maps, but Marie made them matter. Anyone could draw lines on silk. She turned those lines into lifelines." Henri Marchand, the textile printer who developed the inks and techniques for transferring maps to silk, used his wartime innovations to rebuild his printing business after liberation. He became successful producing high-quality textile prints, though he never forgot that his most important work had been done in secret, creating tiny maps that helped people find their way to freedom. The impact of the map doll operation extended far beyond the specific individuals it helped directly. Word of the technique spread through resistance networks across occupied Europe, inspiring similar operations in other countries. Each adaptation was unique, suited to local conditions and available resources, but all shared the same basic insight that Marie had demonstrated. The best hiding places are often in plain sight, disguised as something so ordinary that no one thinks to look twice. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. And check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.